Hi there, my name is Leslie Hertig and I'm the Artistic Director at the Vancouver Writers Fest. Welcome, we're so glad that you're joining us here today. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to and watch here today, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're very honored to be here. I'd like to just start by thanking our government sponsors for helping us put this festival on. CMHC Granville Island, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver. We could not put this on without their financial support, so thanks to them. And to all of you kids joining us today, we are so glad you're here. You are, in fact, the first of our audiences as we kick off this festival. And I couldn't be more pleased than to introduce you to our author today. Tanya Lloyd Kyi describes herself as a children's writer, an avid reader, and a thinker of copious random thoughts. Lucky for us that those thoughts have been woven into multiple best-selling fiction and nonfiction books for kids, including her latest, This Is Your Brain on Stereotypes, How Science is Tackling Unconscious Bias. You might also recognize these two books. Maybe some of you have read them. She's a great fiction writer as well. I encourage you to check out those books. But right now, let's talk about Your Brain on Stereotypes with Tanya Lloyd Kyi.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today, and a big thank you to the Vancouver Writers Fest for having me. It is a great honor to virtually talk to you all in your homes and in your classrooms, and today I get to talk all about This Is Your Brain on Stereotypes. I've written more than 25 books for kids, and of all of them, this one was the most fascinating to research. Every single time I turned on my computer to work on it, I found out something that amazed me, that I had had no idea about before. And so today I'm going to share some of those favorite stories with you. I'm going to talk about a few interesting things and a few silly things and a couple really serious things. I'm going to, as we go through, I'm going to read you 3 different pages from the book. And in the middle, I'm going to show you some slides. So I'm going to start, just to sort of give you an idea of what the book is about, I'm going to start just with a page from the introduction, and I'm going to read it to you. Our brains constantly sort and label the world around us. It begins when we're babies. Those 4-legged barking things, those are dogs. The bouncy things are balls. Toys are different from food, and food is different from milk. We need these categories. Without them, we would open our closets each morning and wonder which items of clothing go on our legs and which go on our arms. And, wait a second. These aren't gloves. These are socks. We need these categories. Without them, we would stare into our desk drawers, wondering which item's right and which one's erase. But our brains don't only sort things, they sort people. And that's where life gets complicated. When we group people into a category and we assume that they all share certain traits, that's called a stereotype. Some stereotypes seem to be based on fact. For example, picture someone playing video games. Do you picture a boy? If so, you're not wrong. About 60% of regular gamers are male. But not all gamers are male, and not all stereotypes are true. By relying on these people categories in our brains, we can make false assumptions. We can even act unfairly towards certain people, all because we've jumped to bad conclusions. When a large majority of people, or even a whole society, holds the same unfair stereotypes, real people pay the price. So that's page 1 of the book, and I'm going to switch to some slides, and I'm going to show you a few things about these categories in our brains. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. This funny guy inside our heads controlling what we think. So as we talk about categories, I'm going to show you some pictures, and I know that some of you are in your classrooms and some of you are in your houses, but wherever you are, I want you to look at the picture that pops up on your screen, and I want you to call out breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So yell out what you think this category is. Are you ready? So probably you called out breakfast. I would consider this breakfast. Dinner. Lunch. Few more. Lunch. My teenage daughter would call this midnight snack. I'm going with lunch. Breakfast. Dinner. Last ones. Dinner. Lunch. Wait a second. Umbrellas are not breakfast or lunch or dinner, but they do show why it's really important to have these categories in our head, because without those categories, we would open our cupboard in the morning and we would have no idea which foods we want to eat for breakfast. And we might find ourselves nibbling on our umbrellas. So we need the categories. They're good for food. They're great for outdoor gear, but they get a little tricky when we start applying the categories in our heads to other people. I'm going to show you. This is sort of what I'm going to talk about today for the rest of the day. What are stereotypes? What are those pictures in our heads? How they affect us, and how we might be able to tweak our own brains so we're not relying quite so much on those categories. Now, the whole reason I got interested in writing about this subject for this book is because of something that happened to my husband, Min. You can see here, that's Min and my son, Matthew. Min was born in Burma, so he's brown. Number one important fact for this story. Number two important fact is that he is the least shy person I have ever met. I think Ms. House is watching this presentation. She can tell her class because she knows Min. He is not at all shy. He is pretty much willing to say anything to anyone. So Min is an occupational therapist. And a couple years ago, he was invited to a conference in Edmonton. And he was asked to do the keynote presentation. Now, the keynote is kind of the most important talk of the whole conference. He's going to be in a big conference room speaking to about 350 people. And it's his job to get them all enthusiastic and excited and revved up about the conference, about occupational therapy, about their careers. So he flies into Edmonton and he gets there the night before the conference. He checks into the hotel and he says, "Oh, do you mind if I just go peek into the conference room to see where I'll be speaking tomorrow?" So they give him a key and he lets himself in, and he's wandering around just checking out the podium and looking where everybody's going to be sitting, and imagine 350 people are going to be there listening to him in the morning. And then all of a sudden, the door from the conference room next door opens, and in rushes a woman from that conference room, and she says, "Oh, thank goodness you're here. We've been waiting forever to get the heat turned up." And Min, because he is not shy at all and is willing to say anything to anyone, says, "Do you think that I'm the building engineer because I'm brown?" And of course, that's what she did think. And she was so embarrassed, and she apologized, and she felt terrible. And maybe something like this has happened to some of us before, where we say something stupid because we have made a dumb assumption. But it's caused by those categories lurking in the backs of our heads. And maybe in the back of her brain, this woman had some boxes that looked like this. And the one on the left is the custodian box, and the one on the right is the keynote speaker box. And Min fit more closely into her category of the person on the left. So when we start using those categories to sort out people, life gets tricky and sometimes awkward and embarrassing. So I'm going to give you some categories and see what pops into your mind when you think of these categories. Oh, first I'm going to tell you about Walter Lippmann, who was a journalist and a philosopher in the 1920s. And until Walter Lippmann, the word stereotype basically meant photocopy. When they put something on the printing press and the printing press made copy after copy of the same thing, that was called a stereotype. But Walter noticed something about his news articles. He noticed that when he was presenting facts in his articles, people did not necessarily interpret those facts objectively. They seemed to already have pictures in their brains. And when they saw his facts, Instead of seeing them objectively, they fit the facts into the pictures that were already in their brains. And he called that a stereotype in their brains. And that's when we started using the word stereotype to mean those categories and those pictures in our heads. Okay, so here are your categories to think about. Think about grandma. What do you picture? Maybe something like this. This is kind of what my grandma looks like. What do you picture when you think gamer? We talked about this before. Maybe something like this. What if you think skateboarder? I would picture something like this. And when somebody says ballet dancer, the image that pops into my head is someone in a tutu. But of course, if we stop to think about it for a little bit longer, those sudden pictures in our brains could actually become 100 different pictures. When we think grandma, we could think of someone like this. This is the type of grandma I would like to be one day. When we think gamer, we could think of this. Now, this is not just a staged picture. This is Grandma Gamer from Tokyo, and she kicks butt. When we think of skateboarder, we might think of this skateboarding girl who's 11 years old and has launched a campaign in Britain to get more girls skateboarding. And when we think ballet dancer, we could think of a picture that didn't involve a tutu at all. So we can widen those pictures in our brains and rely a little bit less on the stereotypes. Now, as we found out from Min's story of the woman at the conference, the trouble with stereotypes and categories in our brain is they can make us think of different people a little bit differently. Harvard has come up with a test called the IAT. And if you wanted to later, you can go look this up on the internet and you can actually take the IAT. IAT stands for Implicit Association Test. And implicit is a type of memory. It's the type of memory you don't even have to think about. So you know that the sky is blue, and you know what cold water feels like, and you know what scissors do. And you don't even have to think about those things, because way back before you could properly talk, you learned about those things, and it's buried somewhere deep in your memory. That is implicit memory. And that's where those stereotype pictures live. So a professor at Harvard named Anthony Greenwald and his team developed a test to see how those pictures worked in people's minds. And then they gave the test to another Harvard professor named Mahzarin Bhanji. And here's what the test kind of looked like. They gave her one category for man and one category for woman. And then they gave her a whole bunch of cards. And they said, please put all the cards that have work words with the word man and all the other cards with the word woman. So Mahzarin went through the cards, and she went through and she said, okay, athlete with woman, business with man, babies with woman, nurture with woman, wealth with man, work with man, fashion with woman, cooking with woman. And that took her a certain amount of time. Let's say it took her 10 seconds to do that test. And then they said, great job. Now go through those cards and sort them the opposite way. Put all the work words with woman and all the other words with man. So no problem. Mahzarin started going through the cards again. And she put athlete with man and business with woman and babies with man and nurture with man and wealth with woman and work with woman and fashion with man and cooking with man. And it took her 12 seconds. Now those aren't the exact times, but it took her significantly longer to put the work words with woman than it did to put the work words with man. And Mahzarin thought, this test is broken. This test is ridiculous. Something is wrong with this test. Because of course she was a professor at Harvard. She had worked very hard her whole life. She was very invested in her career. So how could it possibly take her longer to match work words with the word woman? But it did. And when she went back to the other professors and she complained, this test of yours is broken, they said, it's not broken. Almost everybody fails it. It's designed to show the stereotypes that you hold in your head. And society has a stereotype that men are more strongly associated with work. And so almost everyone takes longer to associate work words with women. And then they showed Mahzarin another version of this test, which was even more interesting. It looked like this. And they said, please go through and put all the positive words with the card saying white. So she went through and she put awards with white, party, success, rich, all with white. And let's say it took her 10 seconds. And then they said, now please put all the positive words with the word black and all the other words with the word white. So she went through and she put awards with black, suffer with white, party with black, success with black, poverty with white, violence with white, rich with black, prison with white. And it took her longer. It was harder on her brain. And they said that's because society has a stereotype that black is more negative and white is more positive. And they, since then, this was in the very early stages of this test, and Mazarine was so fascinated by this test that she changed her work to focus just on this test, and she started giving it to tons of people all around the world. And all across North America and in lots of other places around the world, almost everybody fails this test. It doesn't matter if they're black, it doesn't matter if they're white, it doesn't matter if they're rich or poor. Almost everybody fails this test because society has such a strong stereotypical view of white being more positive than black. So no matter how hard we work at it, it's hard to escape those stereotypes that exist around us. Now I'm going to read you my second page. I said I was going to read you 3 different pages. Here's the second page. It's called Nothing to See Here. When you meet someone, do you mention that you fart in your sleep? Or maybe you say, hello, nice to meet you. Sometimes when a sneeze catches me by surprise, snot flies out of my nose. Yeah, probably not. You probably keep those facts hidden away and you focus on making a good impression. Depending on the person you're meeting, a potential friend, a new teacher, the town mayor, you might choose to reveal and hide different things. That's normal. It's one of the ways we humans try to fit in with those around us. Imagine your life as a theater. The people nearby are the audience. They see your stage where you present yourself to the world. But you also have a backstage where you do your thinking and you keep your secrets. The difference between the stage and the backstage is what researchers call impression management. That term was coined by a Canadian-born professor named Irving Goffman in the 1950s. And basically, impression management means that we try to hide our flaws and present our best face to the world. We talk about fashion instead of sleep farts, and we talk about sunshine instead of snot. Having both a stage and a backstage helps us all to get along. It certainly helps us avoid embarrassing situations. But it also makes it more difficult for scientists to figure out how discrimination happens. Impression management was why American researchers in the 1960s and the 1970s found it really tricky to measure racism, because by then everybody knew that racism was wrong. So if they had biased thoughts, they hid them. But that didn't mean that they treated everyone equally in real life. Decades later, we are still all hiding our biased thoughts. Some of the most interesting research I did when I was writing this book was on the differences in the way we say we're going to act and the way we really do act. And scientists have done all sorts of really tricky experiments to figure out this difference. In one of the first experiments, this experiment was called Ralph's Garage. And now this was back before the time of cell phones. So people had to use pay phones, and every once in a while there'd be a pay phone on the side of the highway, and you would need a dime to put in the pay phone to make your call. So they would have this, it was all fake, but they would have a fake caller call someone up and say, hello, is this Ralph's Garage? And of course the person answered would say, no, you have the wrong number. And the person would say, don't hang up. I'm stuck on the highway. My car has broken down and I've just put my last dime in the payphone. Could you please call Ralph's Garage for me and tell them to please bring a tow truck and pick me up on the highway? Now, the researchers found that when that voice on the phone was a Black person, and they also found that 99% of the time, people could tell right away whether that voice on the phone was a Black person or a white person. When it was a Black person, they were a little bit less likely to call Ralph's Garage for them. When it was a white person calling to say they were stuck on the highway, people were more likely to help them out by calling Ralph's Garage. So that was the first big experiment that showed even when people said, I'm not racist, I would never be racist, the way they acted actually showed differently. And there's been a whole bunch of other experiments since then. That was way back in the 70s that they did that one. But there's been other really interesting ones. One like this, where they took two resumes that looked really similar, except one had a picture of a white person and one had a picture of a person of color. And they attached these resumes to an envelope that already has the address written on it and it already has the stamp. And then they would leave them on the chairs in the airport. And it was as if somebody meant to mail away their job application, but at the last minute, their flight got called and they rushed away and they forgot their job application on the chair beside them. And the researchers spread these resumes around and then they watched to see who would mail them. And the same kind of thing happened as it happened with Ralph's Garage. When the resume had a picture of a white person on it, people were more likely to be helpful. They were more likely to pop that resume in the envelope and pop it in the mailbox. And they were a little bit less likely to help out when the resume showed a picture of color. So there's all sorts of really fascinating experiments like this that showed people, no matter what they said, still held bias back in the back of their brains where their implicit memory lived. And it's so hard to escape this, no matter how hard we try, because it's not just us with those pictures in the back of our brains. Those stereotypes are held by society all around us, and they're in the media and they're on the news. And so I'm gonna show you just quickly a few of the really interesting studies I read about how this works in the world. So when researchers ask little kids in preschool, in kindergarten, hey, who do you think is smarter, girls or boys? The boys say boys are smarter and the girls say girls are smarter. But when they ask kids in grade 1, the boys still say boys are smarter and the girls start to say that boys are smarter. So even by grade 1, they're starting to absorb this stereotype that boys maybe are better at math, better at science, better at school. Here's another one. This one is from the United States. So business ideas pitched by men. So if you've seen something like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank on TV, those are people pitching their business ideas and trying to get money. Business ideas pitched by men are more likely to get money than business ideas pitched by women. And if the men are attractive, they get even more money. So those are those same stereotypes from grade 1 brought up into the grown-up world, and they've gotten stronger and their effects have gotten stronger. This is research from Belgium, and this is a Belgian politician on your screen. Female politicians get less media coverage than male politicians. Men are mentioned more often and given more time to speak, which is not fair at all. Now, this same statistic applies in the United States and in Britain and Australia. It probably applies in Canada. They just haven't done the study here. Only 3% of newspaper sports stories feature female athletes. That's 3% is tiny, a tiny, tiny little amount. And in the United States, LGBTQ youth are twice as likely as their peers to be bullied at school. So as you can see, these stereotypes just exist inside society all around us. And I told you I was gonna talk about serious things as well. So this is my serious part. This is a story of where stereotypes went very, very wrong. And they actually ended up killing someone. So I'm gonna read you this. This is the 3rd page out of the book that I'm gonna read you. In 2004, a 45-year-old Indigenous man named Brian Sinclair wheeled himself into a Winnipeg emergency room. Now, he had had both legs amputated, but he came in with a urinary tract infection. Now, a urinary tract infection makes it hard to pee, basically, and it's usually very easily treated with antibiotics. So that's what Brian Sinclair had when he came into the emergency room in Winnipeg. But for more than a day, Brian sat slumped in his wheelchair in the waiting room. 4 separate strangers approached hospital staff members to voice their concerns about Brian, but still he was ignored. When doctors and nurses walked by, they saw an Indigenous man, probably homeless. They assumed he was drunk, or he'd already been discharged, or he was trying to escape the cold weather outside. None of them asked him what was wrong. So was the hospital staffed by racists? The doctors and nurses would likely say no, but they made assumptions about Brian without talking to him or examining him. They jumped to conclusions based on the stereotypes deep in their minds. 34 hours after he arrived in the emergency room, Brian died. Now, the good news is that people were horrified by this, and the doctors and nurses got together with some professors and they started something called the Brian Sinclair Working Group to figure out what had gone wrong. After years of study, they released a report and they concluded that Brian was killed by racism. Hospital staff had seen an Indigenous man and they assumed he was drunk, not sick. That implicit bias, the judgments that doctors and nurses didn't even realize they were making, leads to other sorts of medical errors too. Studies have shown that American emergency room doctors give blood clot therapy less often to Black patients. Women having heart attacks are more likely to be misdiagnosed. LGBTQ people are less likely to get good medical care. Discrimination can be as simple as body language. Doctors who feel bias against certain patients might lean away from them or make less eye contact. And even when patients don't consciously recognize the bias, they feel it. They might ask fewer questions or return to the doctor's office less often. Doctors are human. They fall prey to the same biases we all do, but everyone deserves great medical care. And the other good news is that today, activists and researchers are working very hard to make sure all patients are treated fairly, whether or not they're part of minority groups. And if you have a copy of This Is Your Brain on Stereotypes in your classroom or at your house, you'll be able to read more about some of the things that doctors are doing in hospitals to try to counteract these kind of stereotypes. So that is my very sad story of what can happen when stereotypes go very wrong. Now, I'm going to talk about something that I had never heard of before I researched this book, and that is how stereotypes affect us and how we apply stereotypes to ourselves. So I have a job for you. Sometimes we dress in ways that make other people draw conclusions about us. So we are actually helping other people jump to stereotypes. So here's some of the ways we might do this. We might wear a dress or a skirt to tell people that we're a girl or a woman. We might wear piercings. We might wear hair accessories. If you have a brand name on your shirt, that might tell people, oh, I'm an athlete, or it might tell people, oh, I'm wealthy, I can afford this fancy shirt. A sports jersey might tell people what sport you play or what sport you love. A sports watch might tell people you're a jock. Braids or dreadlocks might tell people about your culture. You might wear religious symbols. You might wear super expensive running shoes. So I'm going to give you a minute to look down at your outfit and count the number of ways that you are telling people about yourself just by the things you're wearing. So take a minute to touch your hair, touch your ears, see if you have earrings in or jewelry on, check out your shirt. I did this presentation. I was practicing last night and I gave this presentation to my 13-year-old son. And he very confidently said, I have 0. I said, you just took off your jujitsu hoodie and you have a jujitsu shirt on underneath. He did not have 0. So take a second and count them up. If you want, you can type the number you come up with into the chat. My guess is that almost all of us will have at least 1 or 2, and some of us might even get up to 3 or 4. Now, there are some useful things about stereotyping ourselves for other people. It can help us connect with people who are like us and similar to us and people who have the same interests as us. Imagine if you love motorcycles and all you want to do is ride motorcycles and talk about motorcycles and make jokes about motorcycles and research motorcycles. Now, if you needed to find a friend, you could go around asking people, oh, hello, nice to meet you. Do you like motorcycles? Hi there, I'm just looking for someone to ride motorcycles with me. Do you like motorcycles? Oh, hello, very pleased to meet you. Do you want to go motorcycle riding with me? Hi, do you like motorcycles? We could do this, but it would take us a long time to find someone to hang out with. Fortunately, we stereotype ourselves for other people. And if you see this guy, you'd be like, yes, You want to talk about motorcycles with me. So when we're wearing these things that give other people little clues about us, it can help us find friends and it can help them see us as a potential friend. So stereotypes are not entirely bad. But there are also some tricky ways that this sort of stereotyping of ourselves can backfire. And it's something called stereotype threat. And I had never heard of it before I researched this book. But it turns out that, of course, because society holds these big stereotypes, we know if society holds those stereotypes about us. Now, imagine you're dressed like a jock. You're wearing your basketball jersey, your fancy shoes, your sports watch, and you walk in to take a math test. And everybody else in the whole room, let's say they just came from a fancy private school and they're wearing their uniforms with their blazers and their ties. And you have to sit in the middle of that room and take the math test. You are scientifically proven to do less well on that math test than you normally would because you know that everybody thinks you're a dumb jock. The same thing would happen to a girl who has to go in and take that math test in the middle of a whole room of boys because she knows that society holds a stereotype that boys are better at math. Now, the good news is that these sorts of stereotype threats are very easy to get rid of. You could, for example, have everybody dressed in sports jerseys go write the math test. You could have the room be half girls and half boys. If you were going to ask people questions about their age or their gender or their ethnicity on a test, if you put those questions at the end of the test instead of the beginning, so it doesn't cue those stereotypes in people's minds, people will do better on the tests. So there's lots of ways that scientists are working on to help alleviate this sort of stereotype threat. This is kind of an interesting one I came across. It's a professor from the University of Washington, just across the border. And she was mad because there are never any girls in her programming classes. She thought, why are there no women in computer programming? But she looked around the computer lab one day and she saw action figures and Star Trek posters and energy drinks, and it smelled like boys' stinky socks. And she thought, I wonder if this room has anything to do with it. So she created 2 computer labs, and one looked like the regular one with the stinky socks and the energy drinks and the Star Trek posters, and one looked gender neutral. And then she brought in groups of girls and women, and she said to them, hey, would you be interested in computer science? And the girls that came into the gender neutral room were more likely to say, yeah, computer science is pretty cool. I might be good at that. So even by tweaking the world around us, we can help alleviate stereotypes. Now, there are some very easy ways that we can all work to make sure stereotypes are not causing harm. And I've got 5 of them here for you before I wrap up. Number 1 is to be an ally. So if someone is being called names on the playground and you go sit beside them and chat them up, that is called being an ally. If your friend says, hey, I'm kind of interested in joining the Gender and Sexuality Alliance Club, and you, instead of saying, oh, that's interesting, if instead of that, if you say, great, I'll go with you, that is called being an ally. And that is a great way to start fighting against stereotypes. Number 2 is to speak up. So if you notice stereotypes happening, or if you see someone being the victim of stereotypes, then tell someone, tell a teacher, tell your parents, tell the principal. If it's really bad, tell the police. But don't be afraid to speak up and get help. Number 3 is to get involved. You could volunteer for a refugee support agency. Now, this is a little harder during COVID, but these support agencies have volunteer jobs where your entire job is to go be friends with someone who's different than you. That's the volunteer job. Even during COVID, there's things you could do. You can help your librarian create a display of diverse books. You can offer to redecorate your school computer lab. There are ways you can work to combat stereotypes around you. Number 4 is to use your words. So when you see a biased ad campaign, send an email to the company. Or when you think the world is unfair, write a letter to your government representative. I have some pictures up here of easy bake ovens because this is a stereotype that was challenged by a 13-year-old girl named McKenna Pope. She lives in the US and her little brother loved to cook. And she said to him, hey, you should ask for an easy bake oven for Christmas. And he said, I can't do that. Those are for girls. And McKenna thought, well, that's dumb because cooking is for everybody. And she wrote a letter to the company and they invited her into their offices and they had her help design a gender neutral new version of the Easy Bake Oven. She has a TED Talk if you're interested in checking it out. But use your words, write some letters, who knows what would happen. And number 5 is called expand your horizons. The more you hang out with people who are different than you, the less stereotypes you are going to hold. Scientists have a very fancy name for this called the contact hypothesis, but it's pretty common sense. If you have lots of friends who are lots of different people seeing the world in different ways, you're going to see the world in lots of different ways too. Now, for some of us, this is easy. We look around our classroom and there's all sorts of different people. For some of us, maybe this is harder. But if it's hard, if you don't have a lot of people around you who are different than you, start reading books about people who are different. That is also scientifically proven to reduce stereotypes in your mind. So that is the end of my talking about stereotypes, but I have put up some of my other books that you might have seen or read. I'm going to tell you one last story. After that story, we're going to have some time for questions. So while I'm telling this last story, if you want to type some questions into the chat or have your teacher type questions into that chat, go for it and start asking your questions. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you how to pronounce my last name in Burmese. Because remember I told you that my husband Min was born in Burma. So his last name is Kai. That's how my last name became Kai, but it's not pronounced that way in Burmese. I think I'm going to stop sharing my slides here so that you can see me while I tell this story. Okay, so here's your job. Your job, you have to say G, like G's. So say it aloud because you got to get used to this. And you got it. Burmese is a tonal language like Chinese where words that sound very different to my ears, actually very similar to my ears, mean completely different things. So say G out loud. Now you just said large in Burmese. Now say chi, like in cheese. So now you just swore in Burmese. You just said the bad word for poop in Burmese. Now my last name pronounced properly is halfway in between. So you have to make your mouth wide like you're saying cheese, but you say G and it comes out G. And G means clear in Burmese. And that's my last name. But here's what happened. In 1968, my father-in-law came to Canada for the first time and he went around looking for an apartment to rent and looking for a job. And he ran around saying, hello, nice to meet you. And everyone said, oh, welcome to Canada, Mr. Kyi. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Kyi. And of course, they were all calling him Mr. Poop. So after a week or two of that, he said, all right, forget that. We are changing the way our last name is pronounced in Canada. And his family became the Kyi family. And then I married his son Min to become Tanya Kyi. So now when you go home or when your parents say, hey, what did you learn today? You can say, I learned all about stereotypes and I learned to swear in Burmese. 2 very useful skills. All right, I think Leslie is going to come back and she is going to help me do some questions and answers.
Hello, I am back. Thank you so much, Tanya. That was really great. And I learned a lot. Made me really stop and think about what I wear and what I present to other people on a daily basis. I'm curious to know, as you were doing the research for this book, did it make you stop and look at how you were approaching people and your own way of dressing and so on?
It did for sure, yeah. And it made me more aware of things like how people treat women and men differently or how, and I had some interesting conversations with my kids too, because they're brown, of course. So I asked my daughter, she's 16, and I said, well, do you ever experience racism? And she said, no. And I said, well, do people ever ask you funny questions? She said, no, just where are you from? And I was like, what is where are you from? She's like, well, they know I'm from here, but where am I from, meaning Burma? And I was like, well, no one has ever asked me where I'm from. So yeah, it's interesting seeing all the little ways people's behavior is affected by stereotypes.
Yeah. I have a question here from Morgan Fairweather. Hi, Morgan. Morgan asks, malicious as stereotypes may be, many of them are grounded in reality. So should we ignore statistics in favor of removing stereotypes from our brains? To expand on that, where can we draw the line between statistics and stereotypes?
Oh, interesting. I don't think even if we wanted to remove stereotypes from our brain, I don't think we can. So I think that what we were basically trying to do is just make sure we don't act in the moment without recognizing those stereotypes. So, for example, it's statistically true that most video game players are male, but we don't want to make that instant assumption that if somebody's talking about a gamer, they're talking about a guy. So both statistics and stereotypes can exist, and they can be the same as long as we're willing to recognize them and recognize that there's more outside of them.
Indeed, yeah. While we wait for some more questions to come in, do you mind if I ask you what other projects you have on the go?
No, I have next year, I have a book coming out about the science of sleep, which is called Snooze Fest. And it's all about all the action happening in your brain and your body while you're sleeping and you're unaware. And that was really interesting to write too. Ironically, while I was writing it, I spent a lot of nights not able to sleep because I would lay there thinking, I should go to sleep so that I'm smarter tomorrow. I should go to sleep because my reaction times are going to be slower tomorrow. And I knew a little too much, but it was really fun. And I have a couple of picture books coming out. I have a book called Our Green City coming out with Kids Can. That's all about kind of what our cities could look like if they were perfectly utopian and environmental. And that was really fun to work on too.
I'm just curious, do you have a science background that led you to start studying, mental health with your book on stress and now sleep, the very important issue of sleep and so on?
I don't. I mean, I read a lot of science, and I didn't like science when I was in high school. I came to like science more and more as I was an adult. But I like science best when it's explaining things about me or about the world around me, and these interesting research projects. And I'm like, oh, that's why that happens. And when I write my books, I like to combine like a little bit of science and a little bit of history and a little bit of what's happening in the world around us to sort of create a picture of why things might be going on. But mostly I just read about what happens to interest me that day.
That's great. That's
kind of the best part of my job.
Wonderful way to shape your career, I think, because you talk about all sorts of things. Yeah. We have another question here from Michael, and Michael asks, have you heard of the Pygmalion effect as it relates to stereotypes? That's something you've heard of?
I would have to look that up. Nope.
Quick question, in and out. I have
Thank goodness for Google.
Okay. I have another one from Taylor. Taylor asks, are you planning on doing any other Zoom chats based on your other books? My students are very interested and have enjoyed this session today.
If you check my website, I do virtual presentations, and there's also a free presentation. Now, here's the lovely Writers Festival, and I'm talking about somebody else's festival, but I'm doing it's called Tweens Read, and it's a festival from Texas, and I'm doing a panel with them on Thursday about me and Banksy.
Good. Okay, good. Our friend Holman Wang asks, what do you think is the most pernicious source of stereotypes? The media, dinner time chatter, literature, something else?
Oh, interesting. Hi, Holman. There's one study in my book where they did a study on babies that were like 3 months old. And they had babies I think it was in Israel. And they took a group of white babies raised by white caregivers, and then a group of Black babies raised by Black caregivers. And then they took a group of Black babies in like a refugee center who were cared for by a big variety of people. And they showed the babies' faces to see how the babies would react. And they judge how they react by whether they focus on the face and they look, because that's how little the babies are. But the white babies raised in white homes focused on white faces. The Black babies raised in Black homes focused on Black faces. The refugee babies raised among a diverse group of people focused on both. So even when we're 3 months old, we're absorbing these stereotypes just from the world around us. And I think the media is slowly, the media especially things like advertising and TV, are a huge source of stereotypes. I think the news is slowly trying its best to get better. There's some research about some Black Lives Matter marches in the US and how they're portrayed in the media. And it is very slowly getting better, because lots of times those sorts of protests are portrayed as just, this protest was violently destructive, and the news doesn't talk about why the protest happened, what are the issues behind it. And I think they're slowly trying to get better about that.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, we have time, I think, for one more question, and this is coming from Brittany from Scott Creek Middle School. And they ask, are stereotypes the same in different countries, or do they differ and could maybe even be opposite than what we are familiar with in North America? That's a really interesting question.
They do differ. And it has big effects. Like in some countries where the math boys stereotype doesn't affect, it isn't as strong, then girls do much better in math and they're more likely to go into math after high school. And there's interesting individual stereotypes in different places. There's a strong stereotype in Sweden against Muslim people, and that's discussed in my book, because some Muslim people actually change their names so that they sound more Swedish, and then they get more job interviews. Mm-hmm. And there's in Japan, there's different stereotypes depending on which part of Japan you're born in. So there are different ones all over the world.
Thank you. Tanya, it's been such a pleasure. I feel like we've learned so much from you today, and I thank you very much. I hope that the rest of your promotion goes well, and I thank all of the classrooms that have joined us today. We've got lots more events all week long, and I hope that you will check them out. Check out our website. And Tanya, thank you very much for joining us.
I am definitely checking out other events, and thank you very much for having me and for organizing all of this. And thank you to everybody for coming.
Be well. Bye-bye.